Josh, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this centenary tribute to your grandfather, Jerome Moross. It'll be of enormous value to have your personal memories of him and your very personal take on his wonderful artistic qualities as well. I'd like to begin with a question which I've asked most people, and I've had very varying responses, which is, we know so well that Moross's reputation, perhaps most of all, has been as a composer of what's sometimes called Americana. But I've often felt that there's something more than just that in his music, because I've felt, and I wonder whether I am mirroring your views or whether you think I'm wrong, and feel free absolutely to say if you don't agree with me. But I think that there is Moross's background in his music, by which I mean not his immediate background, but his ethnic background, his Jewish background, because there is often such a strong pathos. And it's not to say that other American composers don't have pathos, but there is a particular kind of very poignant pathos, I feel, in so much of his music, and such a variety of music. Yes, it's very American, but look at the huge difference between the style of, for instance, Frankie and Johnny, and, for that matter, when we come to the film music, The Big Country, and other works. Huge range. Anyhow, lots of questions in one there, and I wonder how you feel about it.
The question you raise is an excellent one, which is how does my grandfather, who born a nice Jewish boy in New York City, ends up writing what is often considered quintessential American music. And certainly he was inspired by his trips out west. He talks about his first time going out west and just being amazed by it, which, of course, must have played into The Big Country. In terms of Frankie and Johnny, that has more of a kind of a salacious, gritty New York urban edge to it. And so where that comes from, it's honestly something of a mystery to me. But he was very observant. My Uncle Charlie has talked about in interviews, Charlie was his younger brother. And at a certain point, my grandfather graduated from high school at a very early age and was kind of a young man about town. And his younger brother was somehow sort of passed on to him my grandfather would take care of Charlie, I suppose you could say. And Jerry would say, let's go off and hear, he wanted to hear carousel music because maybe he was thinking about writing something with carousel music. So the two would go off to Coney Island, and my Uncle Charlie, his younger brother, talks about that, they got some beers and they sat there and they listened to music, to the carousel. At one point, Charlie talks about this, that Esther Younger was this choreographer, modern dancer choreographer. And Charlie said that he and Jerry went off to her apartment one time. There was some kind of event and people were doing nude dancing. I can imagine that my grandfather probably did take off his clothes and dance around. So he was very curious and just outgoing in that sense, even though there was a part of him that you have to be I hesitate to say reclusive. He wasn't reclusive. He was very outgoing. But something where you can sit at a piano for hours composing, but yet not be a hermit and just go out and see the world.
Well, that's a very important point, isn't it? Because I think you've summed up so much his personality. We hear this in some of the interviews which we're playing on our documentary, our radio documentary, interviews with Jerome Moross, I mean. And what comes through is this very, how can we say, very vividly present personality, enormously human and outgoing. However, you hear as well a very deep, not withdrawn, but serious side that is a person who's a very, I would say, inward thinker expressing himself too. So that sort of duality I find very interesting, and it would be very interesting indeed for us to hear if you observed anything like that in your own memories of him.
Well, something before we perhaps shift to speaking about my personal experiences in that way, something I would simply add is that there was something eclectic about his growing up. I think it was his grandfather had run a stable, and then that had somehow turned into a bus line. His mother liked to play the stock market. She liked to play poker. And I know that he went to that family's house and apartment house and ate on, I've heard stories about eating on very fancy sort of gold-lined dishes. And he was born in Brooklyn, but they also lived in the Lower East Side in Manhattan. So Brooklyn and Manhattan are two, particularly at that time, two very different types of places, although certainly part of New York. So somehow all that goes into who he was.
Well, you are, I suppose, bearing out, if I may say so, everything that I've felt, that he was, on the one hand, very straightforwardly American, but on the other hand, very complex, surely. And this, of course, this wonderful culture in him. He studied so many different forms of music, and I think one of the great qualities in Jerome Moross is that he had absorbed so many different styles, and if you like, he'd kind of infiltrated some of those, if that's the right word, unconsciously, I think, into his own musical style, and that enabled him, when it came to the films in particular, I think, to really rise to something very, very special, to a height that's perhaps greater than most film composers. Of course, there have been some wonderful film composers, and as we know, some of the great composers per se, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and others have written music for films, wonderful music. But I think in his film music, there's an extraordinary how can we say, eclecticism in the music. This is one of the things that I think is so special about his film scores, that they vary so much in accordance always with the subject that he was setting. He expressed the character and feelings, the characters, shall we say, and feelings of the different subjects, their different places, different sort of personalities, different ambiances, in a masterly way.
I think you see the outcome when you look at a movie like The Cardinal, where he composed Tango, Dixieland, and that's all his. Those are all, it's all original stuff, but it's complete. He completely understood how to get that style. At the same time, there's other parts of the score, which is really Jerome Moross. And you hear it and you know that that's Jerome Moross. His father was apparently not particularly musical. His mother wasn't particularly musical. His father, though, at one point seemed to have these Punch and Judy type movie houses or theatrical houses in New York. And my understanding is that his Aunt Lena, my understanding is that she would play piano in these houses. So I can imagine my grandfather going into his father's movie houses and hearing this music and seeing what he was seeing, and which was very popular, and influencing him. So he does have this incredible sense of popular music, and yet he could write a symphony that Sir Thomas Beecham would end up playing. He had very eclectic style, as you're saying, and I think part of that also, he practiced that as an orchestrator in Hollywood. When he went out to Hollywood, he started orchestrating, and it was very difficult for him to get composing jobs. And approximately 15 years passed before he got his first real composing job out in Hollywood. But in that process of orchestrating other people's films, he was already a very good orchestrator when he started, but he became an excellent orchestrator. And I'm sure he was listening to other people's styles and having to then take what someone else wrote and turn it into orchestral music. So he was just listening, which is my point.
Yes, indeed, that is exactly the impression that comes across in the interviews we have of your grandfather speaking. And the other impression that comes through is of a wonderfully sensitive, elegant, strong, but warm, kind man, don't you think? It would be very interesting to hear how you experienced his personality in that way yourself. I think he was a very human person, wasn't he?
That's right. My grandfather, he really was a warm person. He was a very generous person. A story that I can tell is my brother and I grew up in Miami, and my grandparents would come down and visit us during the winters. And at one time, my grandfather, he was a great sport. He would take us to movies. He would take us to restaurants. And one time he took us, my brother and me, to Burger King. And somebody, maybe my grandfather asked someone to wipe down the table, or someone came over and wiped down the table. And my grandfather tipped him. Now, my brother and I, the little, I don't know, I want to say snots that we were, we were horrified. Who tips someone at a fast food restaurant? Well, my grandfather did. That's the kind of person he was. He and my grandmother had a wonderful circle of friends that they cared about. People cared about them. They loved to go to the theater. They loved to go to concerts. We would go up to New York during the summers, my brother and me, and I would go off to camp during part of the summer. And my grandfather and my grandmother, they would write us letters. And they were always talking about, we're going to be going to this mostly Mozart concert. We've seen there's nothing going on. We've seen everything on Broadway and off Broadway. But, fortunately, mostly Mozart's coming up. That's not really speaking about him being a gentleman, but this being engaged with the world. When I reread his interviews, I can hear his voice very distinctly. He will sometimes correct the interviewer, but it's never rude. It's always, he was precise, and he simply tries to get his facts correct. He wasn't conceited, arrogant, cruel. He wasn't like that at all. Now, of course, I'm partial since he is my grandfather, but I think that was true.
Oh, I don't think you're being at all, shall we say, partisan because of your connection with Jerome Moross, his grandson. Not at all. He had very high human principles. We know this from the way that he helped people and his beliefs and his attitudes towards other artists. I think this humanitarian quality in him was a mixture, I think, of his emotional personality, of course, but also of his intellect, because he was wasn't he? He was an incredibly well-read person, a really erudite person. And I think this was his philosophy of life. Some of it had come from his erudition. I mean, he was enormously informed about so many things, wasn't he?
Yes, my grandfather, he had studied the classics. He was a voracious reader. He'd studied the classics. And as an aside, he had told my mother when she was studying geometry in high school, he said that she should learn her geometry from reading Euclid, because that's how he learned his geometry. And it's probably true. So that sense of being completely steeped in the classics and then being able to pull all that and turn it into Americana, which is what he does, for example, so well with the Golden Apple.
Yes, and in the Golden Apple, of course, we have something that, if you like, almost epitomizes so much of what he did and who he was. The Golden Apple is really an opera in that it's written for the performers in an operatic way. You can't, in my view, really do it justice unless you've got operatic qualities as a singer. But it's not an obvious opera. It sounds in many ways like a musical, and yet it's not an obvious musical, and it's operatic. Now that's Jerome Moross to me, that he was able to combine those two elements so brilliantly in the Golden Apple.
Yes. I think it requires from singers basically operatic chops. You have to really be able to sing to make your way through that entire piece. And yet it has this sense of being popular. And there are songs such as Lazy Afternoon that you can just pull out of the musical and sing on their own. So I think you're right.
Josh, I think you do have some memories, don't you, of your grandfather and your grandmother in their home. It would be really lovely to hear your impressions or your recollections of what the home was like and how they were in their home.
Yes. My grandparents, the apartment that I knew was the apartment at 610 West End Avenue, apartment 9C. We've seen Woody Allen movies where there are artist couples with these fantastic apartments. The set dresser from a Woody Allen movie could probably take something from my grandparents' apartment. It was very down to earth. It was full of books. My grandfather, and he'd read all of them. He had everything from Chaucer to Gore Vidal, whom he was friends with. He had all these Time Life series books, the ones that people would order back in the day. You'd get 20 volumes about insects, and he had read them. He composed at a baby grand piano that was in the living room. If he looked to his left, there was windows looking north, uptown, on the west. This was the Upper West Side. If he swiveled to the right, he had a card table like a bridge table, that he had all his tools, protractors and pencils and erasers, and he had perfect pitch. He could compose without writing if he needed to, I'm sure. But there was this back and forth process for him of playing something at the piano, then swiveling over, jotting something down in pencil. And he had fantastic concentration, so you could go about your business in the rest of the apartment while he was composing. They had a record collection that was a very small record collection, which surprised me. He didn't listen to records very much, even though he was listening to music. He was going to concerts, to musicals, but he didn't sit down and listen to records per se. I think of him as I see him as this sitting at his kitchen in the morning with his New York Times, which he'd fold up as though he were a commuter, reading his paper, doing the crossword puzzle. And then he would, I guess, get dressed and go compose. I should mention the piano was, for years, I thought that this was a beloved piano. I've since learned that the piano, the soundboard, was actually cracked. He hated the piano. So he actually worked at a piano he didn't really love.
That's touching, I think. In fact, the whole story, in a sense, which of course we're telling in our documentary, is touching. It's a story of a wonderful composer of tremendous creativity, strength and sensitivity, and a human being of strength and sweetness, I would say. And so there is a real poignancy in this story. Josh, thank you. Josh Tarjan, thank you very much indeed for giving us your unique, valuable recollections, your personal recollections of your grandfather, Jerome Moross. And it's been very moving for me, actually, to hear you speak about your grandfather. It's always very special. Of course, we have Susanna and also your brother Aaron on this program we're making, and also in the archiving we're embarking on. We're archiving all these interviews, and to have the personal connection with this man who's been something of a kind of remote figure in many ways to music lovers, in that he wasn't a publicist and didn't talk about himself much. And although connoisseurs know the greatness in his music, wonderful qualities, we've not known much about him. And so to have these personal cameos of him, that's terribly valuable. So Josh, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us for the Jerome Moross Centenary celebrations. It's been really excellent and most valuable to speak with you. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.